For decades, the world believed the Challenger disaster was a fully explained tragedy, a technical failure written into history books and recounted in documentaries. But after years of silence, declassified files, forgotten testimonies, and new discoveries began to reveal a story far darker than anyone imagined. What if the explosion the world witnessed live wasn't the true end, but the beginning of a cover-up that concealed what really happened to the crew and why the warnings were ignored? Stay with us, because what was uncovered in the Challenger investigation will change everything you thought you knew about that fateful day. The shuttle that was never meant to fly so soon. The Challenger was born in an era of contradictions. NASA, once the unstoppable force behind the Apollo triumph, found itself cornered by budget cuts and public indifference. The agency that had sent men to the moon now struggled to prove its worth in peacetime. The space shuttle program was marketed as the solution, a reusable and cost-effective vehicle that could make space travel as routine as a flight from New York to Los Angeles. But behind the optimistic speeches, cracks were already appearing. The engineering was experimental, the deadlines impossible, and the expectations unrealistic. As early as the late 1970s, engineers warned that the shuttle's design was based more on political considerations than safety. The Pentagon wanted it to carry massive reconnaissance satellites, while NASA wanted civilian access to orbit. This tug-of-war forced compromises. The shuttle had to be large enough for military payloads, but light enough to escape Earth's gravity. Each change brought greater complexity, and with it, greater risk. Even so, the agency promised Congress 30 launches a year. The reality was that the shuttle's response time made even 6 launches seem heroic. In the early 1980s, NASA was caught in a cycle where performance trumped prudence. The agency's budget depended on public success, so every mission became a jewel. Challenger's track record seemed solid. It had flown 9 times without disaster. But what the public didn't see were the minor malfunctions recorded after each flight. Plates damaged by thermal stress, thrusters showing signs of wear, and seals that had to be inspected again and again. Every problem was cataloged, discussed, and then accepted as part of normal operations. It was normalization by necessity. The mission that would become Challenger's last was meant to restore NASA's image as a pioneer in education. The Teacher in Space program was the agency's response to the waning enthusiasm. Krista McAuliffe, a 37-year-old high school teacher, had captured the nation's imagination. Her inclusion brought the launch worldwide attention, but it also gave NASA one more reason to stick to the schedule. The agency had already faced criticism for the delays, and the press was eager for a spectacle. It was no longer just a mission, it was a promise to millions of students watching. Every time the shuttle remained on the launch pad, the pressure to meet deadlines increased. Launch schedules were seen as political commitments, and any delays had to be justified to Washington. Inside NASA, some engineers admitted that the agency had shifted from a safety-first culture to a launch-first mentality. Deadlines were sacrosanct, and concerns were too often dismissed as pessimism. The Challenger's STS-51L mission was rescheduled several times due to weather and technical problems. But on January 28, 1986, the patience of the top brass finally ran out. They wanted to demonstrate that the shuttle could launch on time, no matter what. Signs of trouble were already visible. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the solid rocket boosters, had been monitoring the erosion of the O-rings for years. They had warned that the cold could harden the rubber seals too much, rendering them inoperable. However, as the countdown progressed, the warnings seemed to take a back seat to public relations. The desire to preserve NASA's image outweighed the fear of mechanical failure. The morning frost that coated the shuttle's boosters should have been enough to stop the launch. Instead, it became another ignored omen. In hindsight, Challenger wasn't lost simply because of mechanical failure, but because of human overconfidence. The dream of routine spaceflight had become a stationary machine. Behind the cameras in the countdown, thousands of decisions were made, mixed with hope, denial, and pressure. The Challenger story didn't begin in the sky. It began in the boardrooms, where silence was easier than scrutiny. Could it be that Challenger's fate was sealed long before it touched the launch pad? Stay with us as the mystery deepens. The warning letters they tried to bury. Long before the cold morning of launch, the warnings had already piled up. In a quiet Utah office, a group of Morton Thiokol engineers examined stomach-churning photographs. Burn marks marred the seals of solid-fuel boosters from previous shuttle flights. Dark traces indicated that hot gases had leaked through the O-rings meant to contain them. Those black scars betrayed a danger that drew ever closer with each mission. Roger Boisjoli, a senior engineer with decades of experience, couldn't shake the feeling that something catastrophic was looming. In 1985, he wrote a memo describing the O-ring erosion as a potential disaster. It wasn't an opinion. It was a data-driven warning, backed by test results, temperature charts, and launch logs. The memo made its way up the chain of command, yet somehow its urgency dissipated as it ascended. Management reviewed it, nodded solemnly, and moved on. The documentary record that could have saved lives ended in silence. NASA's relationship with Thiokol was entangled in red tape. The agency needed the propellants for every flight, but the contracting system blurred accountability. When Thiokol engineers raised safety concerns, NASA officials dismissed them as production delays. The success flight culture meant that the mission schedule mattered more than uncomfortable questions. It was a system designed to discourage doubt. During 1985, the evidence became impossible to ignore. A discovery launch that summer revealed a visible leak of ogen at both booster seals. Post-flight analysis confirmed O-ring erosion worse than any seen before. Boisjoli and his team submitted report after report, warning each time that colder weather would further harden the seals. On every occasion, management labeled the problem within the flight history. It was a bureaucratic phrase that masked a growing threat. What few outside NASA understood was that every shuttle flight was, technically, an experiment. The boosters were redesigned in minor details after almost every mission, but the data was never updated quickly enough to predict the next failure. Internally, engineers worried that the O-ring problem had become unpredictable. They requested a complete redesign of the seals, a costly and time-consuming solution that would delay multiple launches. NASA's response was blunt: work with what you have. By the end of the year, Boisjoli had reached his breaking point. He wrote directly to Thiokol's vice president of engineering, demanding immediate action. His memo was clear. If the problem persisted after another cold launch, it could destroy the vehicle and kill the crew. The letter was marked urgent, but no public records show an immediate investigation. Months later, as preparations continued for Challenger's 10th mission, the warnings remained buried in filing cabinets. Behind the scenes, some managers quietly acknowledged that the boosters were unreliable at low temperatures. However, admitting this officially would have grounded the fleet and explained years of ignored evidence. NASA's entire shuttle program and its credibility would have crumbled. It was easier to believe that the engineers were simply being overly cautious. When journalists reviewed these memos after the disaster, one question echoed in every interview: how could so many warning signs have been ignored? The answer lay in the structure of authority. Those who understood the problem lacked the power to stop the launch, and those who didn't grasp the risk. It was a hierarchy that made the warnings were whispered. The night before the launch, as temperatures dropped, Boisjoli and several colleagues made a final plea to delay it. Their conference call with NASA leadership would become one of the most chilling moments in aerospace history, a debate where physics clashed with politics, and politics triumphed. But how exactly did that final encounter unfold, and what words sealed the shuttle's fate? Join us as we explore the hidden corners of the story. The freezing point of failure. The night before launch, an eerie silence hung over Kennedy Space Center. On the launch pad, spotlights cast a dim blue glow over the shuttle as a thin layer of ice spread across its surface. The air clung to the skin, a chill rarely felt in Florida. At Morton Thiokol's Utah plant, engineers peered at screens, watching temperature forecasts plummet far below anything the rockets had ever experienced. The numbers alone told the whole story, but no one at NASA wanted to hear it. At 8:45 p.m. Eastern Time, a conference call began that would decide everything. On one side were NASA officials at Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, eager to stay on schedule. On the other were Thiokol engineers, including Roger Boiscioli, who had spent years monitoring the performance of the O-rings. They presented charts showing how the cold reduced the rubber's flexibility. At 31 degrees Fahrenheit, the seals could fail completely. All the calculations pointed to disaster. The engineers recommended a simple action: delay the launch until the temperature rose above 12 degrees Celsius. It wasn't a challenge, it was data. For a brief moment, silence filled the row as the NASA executives absorbed the warning. Then one of them asked a question that broke the tension. "When do you want me to launch?" April. They weren't talking about safety, but about deadlines. Clearly, the atmosphere had shifted. After the engineers' firm stance, Thiokol management called a private meeting. What happened next remains one of the most impactful corporate moments in American history. Pressed by NASA's expectations to proceed, Thiokol executives turned to their engineering team and asked them to rise to the occasion. It was a coded request. Think about contracts, costs, and relationships, not non-committal agreements. The room fell silent as they understood what was being asked of them. Minutes later, the recommendation was revoked. Thiokol faxed NASA a new approval for the launch, stating that the data was inconclusive. In reality, the data had never been clearer. As Boiscioli left the room, he turned to a colleague and said quietly, "We just signed off on the lives of 7 astronauts." Those words would haunt him for the rest of his life. At Cape Canaveral, the temperature continued to drop. Icicles formed along the launch pad, some more than 12 inches long. Maintenance crews sprayed the pad with water to remove the ice, only to see it refreeze minutes later. By morning, even the cameras capturing the shuttle appeared to be engulfed in frost. The shuttle's once gleaming white boosters were now coated in sheets of ice and condensation. Photographers later commented that it looked beautiful, like a sculpture, but those who understood engineering saw only danger. The NASA launch team assembled at dawn. Meteorologists confirmed record-breaking cold, but officials cited previous delays, the live television audience expected across the country, and the promise that Christa McAuliffe would give a lecture from orbit. The countdown resumed, as if physics could be negotiated with optimism. In the final hours, technicians recorded multiple temperature readings along the booster's joints. The figures hovered around 20 degrees, well below the limit the engineers had warned about. Nevertheless, the decision stood. No tests were conducted to check whether the seals had hardened. No sensors were added to monitor internal pressure changes. The system was trusted to perform as usual, even though nothing about that morning was normal. As the sun rose, the sky turned a pristine blue. It seemed like the perfect day for a launch. What no one realized was that the thrusters were already damaged. The O-rings were brittle, unable to flex. The first few seconds of ignition would test them to the limit. As the crew took their seats and the countdown reached its final moments, history itself was rewinding to that single phone call, the one in which the engineers were told to think like managers. What would happen when those frozen seals met the flames and the pressure ceased to be theoretical and became real? Let us guide you to what no one expected. The 73 seconds that changed everything. At 11:38 a.m., the sky above Cape Canaveral glittered with exhaust fumes. The shuttle's main engines ignited, followed by the solid rocket boosters that roared as they ignited in a cascade of blinding light. The vibration shook the shoreline, setting off car alarms from miles around. Families, students, and journalists gathered, craning their necks to watch the rising plume of white smoke. Among them were Christa McAuliffe's parents, smiling with pride as the shuttle began its ascent. For a brief moment, the Challenger was a symbol of everything America believed about progress: bold, unstoppable, destined for greatness. Inside Mission Control, the atmosphere was tense but routine. Controllers watched rows of data screens flashing green. All systems appeared normal. No one noticed the tiny plume of smoke escaping from the right solid rocket booster. At 678 seconds after liftoff, a plume of black vapor erupted from a gasket on the booster rocket, an instant so brief that the cameras only captured it on high-speed film. The O-ring, hardened by the cold, had failed. Yet for a few moments, the gasket fragments lodged in the gap, temporarily sealing it. The shuttle continued its ascent, unaware that its fate hinged on a piece of charred rubber. As it climbed above 9,000 meters, the cold air thickened. The boosters pressed against the main tank, connected by struts that carried fuel lines and sensors. The external tank, a colossal orange cylinder filled with liquid hydrogen and oxygen, flexed under pressure. At Mission Control, the flight dynamics officer reported, "The engines are throttled up." The shuttle responded smoothly, its plume of vapor billowing across the Atlantic. It was the kind of flawless ascent NASA engineers had dreamed of, but a number on the telemetry began to drift silently. The pressure inside the right booster was dropping. Seconds later, a camera mounted on the launch pad captured the flash of a flame emerging from the side of the right booster. At first, it was faint, hidden by the exhaust trail, but the fire grew. Each vibration widened the gap at the joint. At 70 seconds, the flame struck the external tank, burning through the bracket that held the booster. The structural connection broke, and for the first time, the shuttle's symmetry was shattered. The vehicle lurched, spinning violently as the right booster pivoted inward. The next instant, chaos was disguised as silence. A white flash streaked across the sky. On the ground, it looked like an explosion, but in reality, the shuttle didn't detonate. It disintegrated. The external tank ruptured, releasing a cloud of hydrogen and oxygen that ignited into a massive plume. Pieces of the Challenger, still glowing, were flung out like fragments from a dying star. In the control room, the voice of Flight Director Jay Green cut through the static. "Flight, controllers here, watching the situation very closely. Obviously, a serious malfunction." The words were measured, but the meaning was unmistakable. Among the crowd, the gasps turned to silence. People pointed upward, confused by the branching plumes of smoke. Some thought it was part of the mission, a separation sequence perhaps, until debris began raining from the sky. A teacher watching from the observation deck dropped to her knees. Others stared in disbelief, waiting for an announcement that never came. The television signal went silent as the news anchors struggled to find the words. In the atmosphere, the crew cabin had separated from the wreckage. For the next 2.5 minutes, it continued to ascend before plunging back into the ocean. The astronauts inside, strapped into their seats, were probably still alive, unaware that their cabin had lost its wings. The violent shaking had stopped, replaced by the eerie silence of freefall. Instruments flickered and then shut down. The cabin hit the Atlantic with a force of more than 200 G, an impact no one could survive. At Mission Control, the data streams froze. The last transmission from the shuttle came from pilot Michael Smith, his calm voice cracking mid-sentence. Uh-oh. Then, nothing. Controllers stared at the screens, waiting for the telemetry to return. Or to do so, a heavy silence filled the room. For the first time, NASA's dream of routine spaceflight had been shattered, not in space, but in full view of the world. What no one understood yet was that the tragedy was far from over. As the wreckage spread across the ocean, the subsequent investigation would reveal something even darker, a truth hidden not in the machinery, but in human decisions. Stay here as the next twist unfolds. Inside the falling cabin, the unspoken truth. When the Challenger's cabin hit the ocean, the impact shattered it into fragments no larger than a hand. The force was unimaginable, more than 200 times the force of gravity. Yet for the investigators, the nightmare was only just beginning. The Atlantic became both a grave and a crime scene. Navy ships, Coast Guard cutters, and divers were deployed across an area larger than Rhode Island. The wreckage lay 16 miles off the coast of Florida, scattered across the seabed like a broken constellation. For weeks, rescue teams battled raging seas and exhaustion, hauling twisted metal from the depths piece by piece. Each crate that washed ashore carried more than just debris. It carried questions. As the pieces were reassembled in a restricted hangar, a discovery stunned everyone. The crew cabin was almost intact. Its reinforced aluminum structure had withstood the disintegration that ripped apart the rest of the shuttle. That meant the astronauts hadn't vaporized. They had survived the fall. The revelation forced investigators to confront a chilling possibility. The crew might have been alive long after the explosion the world had watched on television. Inside the wreckage, forensic teams found manually activated oxygen packs. Personal exit air packs, or PEEP packs, were designed for emergencies, not freefall. 3 of them were activated. The one pilot Michael Smith carried showed signs of use, indicating he had tried to activate it in the seconds after the breakup. Switches on the instrument panel were found in positions that could only be moved manually. These were not random impacts, but deliberate actions. The astronauts had tried to regain control. NASA's initial public statement claimed the crew died instantly. This was easier for the families and easier for the agency's image, but the evidence didn't match. A subsequent analysis of the cockpit voice recordings revealed that electricity remained for several seconds after the explosion. The electrical systems remained operational as the cabin ascended to nearly 50,000 feet before beginning its long descent. The cabin remained sealed during the descent, allowing the crew about 70 seconds of consciousness before impacting the ocean. Rescue divers later described what they saw upon reaching the cabin. The structure lay crushed beneath sediment, its windows shattered by the pressure. Inside, all was silent. The seats were still in place, the harnesses intact, and the remnants of the control panels frozen at full power. Official photographs were never released. Out of respect and perhaps fear of public reaction, the images were permanently sealed. The investigation proceeded in secret, guarded by military escorts and government agents who ensured nothing leaked to the press. Official autopsy reports were classified for years. Only fragments of information emerged, statements that some crew members suffered blunt force trauma consistent with a high-speed impact, not an explosion. It confirmed what many already suspected. The astronauts had survived the initial breakup. For their families, it was a revelation both comforting and unbearable. They hadn't died instantly, but they faced those final moments fully conscious. Behind closed doors, NASA debated how much to reveal. Internal memos reveal that the agency feared the psychological impact of the truth. It would be easier for the world to believe that death was instantaneous, that there was no suffering or consciousness. But among the engineers who examined the cockpit, the silence became a burden. Several later admitted that what they saw in those reports haunted them more than the explosion itself. Even decades later, the exact sequence of the crew's final seconds remains uncertain. The recovered fragments were studied, cataloged, and stored in sealed vaults at the Kennedy Space Center, accessible only to the public, or for a handful of people. Arlington National Cemetery, with its graves marked not by how they died, but by what they stood for, courage, sacrifice, and the inexorable price of human ambition. But if the cabin's survival raised so many unsettling questions, what would the investigation into NASA's decisions reveal? Stay with us as the secrets grow even darker. The investigation NASA tried to control. As the last fragments of the Challenger were cataloged and the recovery ships returned to port, the real battle began, not for metal, but for the truth. The nation demanded answers, but inside NASA, a quiet panic gripped everyone. Every department feared being exposed. Once routine meetings became damage control strategy sessions. What would the public think when they saw the engineers ignored memos, warnings, and pleas? The Reagan administration moved quickly to form the Rogers Commission, a panel tasked with uncovering what happened. But even before the first hearing, NASA officials tried to shape the narrative. Internal communications show requests to limit speculation and control the flow of information. Documents were leaked, terminology was softened, and several engineers were quietly advised to avoid inflammatory language. The same culture that had silenced warnings before the launch was now scripting its defense. When the committee convened in Washington, the atmosphere was tense. The testimonies of NASA executives sounded polished, almost rehearsed. They spoke of unforeseen technical failures and tragic anomalies. But then voices emerged that broke the mold. Roger Boyce-Holy and Alan McDonald, the engineers who had pleaded for the launch to be delayed, stepped forward. Their testimonies, calm yet devastating, shattered the illusion of surprise. McDonald's words, "We were told to take off our engineer hats and put on our manager hats," hit the chamber like a thunderclap. Behind closed doors, tensions flared. The commissioners argued over how much truth should be made public. Some feared that exposing NASA's negligence would ruin the agency's future. Others insisted that only full transparency could honor the crew's memory. In the end, the final report revealed what NASA most wanted to hide: a pattern of flawed judgments, suppressed evidence, and decisions made under political pressure. The Challenger disaster was no longer just a mechanical failure, but a reflection of an institution built on denial. But the investigation wasn't over. As divers continued to find new debris months later, another secret was waiting to resurface. Walk with us toward the truth that was never meant to see the light of day. The debris that didn't stay buried. Months after the Rogers Commission released its findings, the ocean continued to reveal its secrets. Fishermen off the coast of Florida began pulling up twisted metal and charred fragments tangled in their nets. Each discovery reignited a pain that was only just beginning to heal. The Navy sent search teams again, this time working silently under orders of secrecy. Their mission was simple: recover everything and say nothing. By the end of 1986, recovery ships had retrieved more than 200,000 pounds of debris from the seabed. The fragments were transported to a massive hangar at Cape Canaveral, where engineers methodically reassembled the Challenger's wreckage. Each fragment was labeled, recorded, and placed in its proper position until the shuttle's ghostly silhouette began to emerge once more. Before it, the investigators felt the weight of their own conclusions. The twisted metal was not just a wreck. It was evidence of wrong decisions, ignored warnings, and institutional blindness that cost 7 lives. NASA faced a painful dilemma: how to honor the dead while also preserving the fragments of its final flight. In 1988, after completing the shuttle's redesign, the agency discreetly transported most of the Challenger's wreckage to an abandoned missile silo at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. Buried deep, the silo became both a tomb and a time capsule. Only a few selected components were saved for future study. It was an act intended to bring closure, though no one ever found it. Years passed, and the ocean continued to whisper. In 1996, construction crews dredging near the shore recovered a section of the fuselage, its aluminum still bearing the burn marks of the re-entry fire. Then, in 2022, a film crew searching for a World War II aircraft discovered a large, sand-covered panel lying intact on the seabed. When NASA confirmed it belonged to the Challenger, the world fell silent once more. The images were haunting, a relic preserved by salt and time, returning to remind humanity of what it had lost. Nearly 4 decades later, much of the Challenger remains buried beneath the waves and concrete, hidden from view, but not from memory. The disaster endures as more than just an engineering tragedy. It stands as a mirror to ambition, showing how progress without humility can turn triumph into sorrow. The Challenger story refuses to fade because it was never just about flying, but about the price of forgetting why we look to the stars. What do you think is the most impactful aspect? Were the warnings from the buried engineers, the evidence that the crew could have survived the explosion, or did NASA's own pressure seal their fate? Share your thoughts in the comments.